I'm HG Masters editor-at-large for Art Asia Pacific, and I'm here with my friend Dan Byers, who is a curator for the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, which is in, let's say, can we say Western Pennsylvania?
I think that's officially the region, yeah.
Okay. Before we begin, just want to remind you that magazines and tote bags are available over there. Postcards are for sale. It's a project called God Bless Diana by Heeman Chong, and there are artist scenes behind me. But Dan and I are going to talk a little bit about the Pittsburgh art scene, and then Dan is one of the co-curators of the Carnegie International, which happens every 4 or 5 years?
4 or 5, this time 5. Yeah.
Okay. And has been traveling, which is how I've gotten to know Dan. So, Dan, I was just going to ask you to sort of lay out, what's the cultural landscape of Pittsburgh in terms of contemporary art?
Pittsburgh is pretty much dominated by a few larger institutions, of which the Carnegie Museum of Art is probably the largest. And we're run by an organization that also runs the Andy Warhol Museum, and we're attached to a natural history museum and the major branch of the Carnegie Library, which was Andrew Carnegie's first and probably largest philanthropic activity, was founding libraries. So our museum is in a campus of an art museum, natural history museum, and major public library. So besides the Andy Warhol Museum, which shows Warhol but also other contemporary art, there's the Carnegie Museum of Art, and then some smaller kind of interesting institutions. There's the Miller Gallery at Carnegie Mellon University, which is an interesting university space, and then pretty famous is the Mattress Factory, which was founded in the late 70s in an old mattress factory, which focuses on installation art and still has that kind of specific focus. And, you know, it's a city with a lot of pretty inexpensive space for artist studios and that kind of thing, and I think there are more and more artists staying in Pittsburgh after graduating from places like Carnegie Mellon, and some people moving there. There's a city called Braddock, which is bordering Pittsburgh, which is sort of a post-industrial model city of a destroyed Main Street and formerly flourishing place that has been with a very sort of charismatic and controversial mayor who's been using artists and art to bring people to there. So it's a sort of raw scene of young artists working there. But, yeah, I would say that's kind of the overview.
I guess I'm interested in the fact that you live there, and our next speaker, William Kaufmel, also lives there. Because in the U.S., art production is so, in a way, centralized in New York, or at least the industry is in New York and in Los Angeles, perhaps with a little bit of scenes in Chicago, and but America has a lot of very large cities with a pretty good infrastructure of museums, but the problem always seems to have been how to get artists to live in those cities, and then also for the institutions that do exist there, which are, as in your case, pretty well funded, with decently funded, but with also a long history. But so, how does the Carnegie relate to the local art scene, and what are its efforts to either nourish or encourage younger artists?
Well, I've always lived in sort of smaller American cities. I lived in Philadelphia for a while, I lived in Minneapolis, and now I live in Pittsburgh. And I've always kind of felt that there are major opportunities, especially from an institutional perspective, to strengthen local art communities. And actually, saying local art community is actually the wrong phrase, and it's something that I'm trying to change in Pittsburgh, where people think about sort of Pittsburgh artists or local artists. And I think the major impact that a large institution can have is to show international contemporary art in the context of also showing Pittsburgh artists from time to time, to reinforce the fact that what happens in Pittsburgh is the same as what happens in Hong Kong or London or New York, or that potentially those things can be the same. And I think that it's easier in smaller cities to have a kind of provincial self-image and be really concerned with what's happening within those bounds. But an institution like the Carnegie is so interconnected with an international art world that to bring that kind of attitude to the city, I think, is really important. And I think artists who choose to live in smaller cities or grow up in smaller cities can be really benefited from exposure to artwork in places like the Carnegie that they wouldn't see in New York. And this was certainly the case, I think, talking to people who grew up in Pittsburgh and sort of would see 3 or 4 Carnegie Internationals based on, how old they were, and sort of become, connoisseurs of large international art exhibitions because they would see 4 of these shows and be able to sort of compare from a curatorial perspective. And when I worked at the Walker Art Center, that was definitely the case in Minneapolis. People often would be exposed to artwork in Minneapolis that they wouldn't see in New York or LA for another few years. So I think it's sort of our responsibility to be, if not ahead of the curve, but showing work that wouldn't be shown in those centers to actually give artists in those cities an advantage.
Yeah, I mean, for example, Life on Mars, which was the last Carnegie International. I mean, Hei Gu Yang's work was in that show before she'd been shown anywhere else in America, and that went for a lot of other artists from Asia and probably from Europe too.
I mean, there's definitely a gap between what we can do and what I can do as a curator in a large institution versus the lack of, commercial galleries or funding or things like that. And I think we can't solve everything, but I think kind of leading by example and being present artists there for conversations and studio visits is...
And you, I mean, I want to talk about the international, but you also have a Pittsburgh Biennial. And, I mean, the reason why I'd be interested to hear you talk about it is that, Hong Kong is building this huge new infrastructure of museums called it's part of the West Kowloon Development Project, and then M+. So they're building a big institution, and someone was asking me last night, why doesn't Hong Kong have a biennial, which, someday it might. But, on the one hand, there are biennials that are conceived of as being international exhibitions, but then you have a I'm going to use the word local biennial. So maybe you could just tell us about that.
Well, this was actually the first year that the Carnegie participated in this exhibition, the Pittsburgh Biennial, which was formerly a biennial exhibition put on by the Pittsburgh Center for the Arts, which is sort of a more typical art center in a way, with art classes and exhibition spaces, but very focused on the local. And they reached out to us and the Andy Warhol Museum and the Miller Gallery at Carnegie Mellon to sort of make it a citywide thing. And it's something that I've been struggling with, is how to show Pittsburgh artists within the mix of international sort of small project shows that I've been doing, and collection shows, and the Carnegie International. And this seemed like the best opportunity to do that because it meant partnering with other organizations in the city. And the way we did it was I showed, I think, 8 or 9 artists, and they were about half artists who were living in Pittsburgh and then half artists who were from Pittsburgh and living elsewhere, who were more than happy to kind of come back to Pittsburgh and show in the museum that they grew up attending. And it was actually a kind of beautiful thing for most of them to show in this place, even though they've gone on to careers showing in other galleries and museums, kind of a homecoming. And it was a big sort of summer show, and it did a lot, I think, for goodwill in the city, and it meant that I could engage with artists living in Pittsburgh beyond a sort of studio visit that didn't go anywhere, because that wasn't really what my program was. And then being able to do that, plus something like the Carnegie International, kind of put those two things on, I won't say an equal footing because the scope is really different, but it gave us a chance to kind of participate more. And also to create a dialogue between artists living in Pittsburgh and those who used to live in Pittsburgh, because, again, it sort of shows a fluidity between the inside and outside.
And we've been referring to it, but maybe you could just give us a history of the Carnegie International, which is quite an old exhibition, and the first of its kind in the U.S., right?
Yeah, so the Carnegie International the first iteration was in 1896, and that was just a few months after the first Venice Biennale. So for a long time, those were the two kind of international survey exhibitions in the world. And what's kind of special about the Carnegie International is that it was really an exhibition founded to build the museum's collection, and the sort of potentially apocryphal phrase attributed to Carnegie is that it was meant to show the old masters of tomorrow, so that the museum wouldn't be opened with old masters, but that this exhibition would sort of build a collection based on pretty much a speculative proposition of who would be next, which is kind of a speculation that we've grown accustomed to in the biennial culture, but that kind of forward-looking mentality. And so the museum's collection is really a reflection, kind of like a layered reflection of different Carnegie Internationals and the different tastes of different curators or museum directors who've organized it, and the prevailing trends of the day. And it's gone in and out of kind of relevance throughout the last 100 years, and there's been times when it was really looking the wrong way, historically speaking, and then times when it really engaged with what, with historical hindsight, was the right thing. But certainly for the last 20, 30 years, it's been very much involved in dialogue with other international exhibitions. And traditionally, there's been a different curator for every round who comes into the museum. So,
is it usually in-house curators, or are there?
It's usually it's people who are in-house curators. They're hired to be the curator of contemporary art and of the Carnegie International. But traditionally, they've left after the show, and then a new person has come on, which has meant that the collection and the exhibition always have a sort of varied and unique perspective. In
a good way, or?
Sometimes, yeah.
Okay.
Institutional memory is one problem, but
it's an interesting idea that the collection, is the memory of those exhibitions in a way.
Yeah, so it means that it's. I mean, each museum's collection is always sort of subjective and fragmentary, but in this case, I think it's more connected to a specific curatorial vision than most collections. I mean, that being said, it still goes through a collection committee process and all that stuff, but it means that we have, very sort of specific collections from each iteration of the International.
And you're one of the 3 co-curators of the next edition, which is September, October 2013?
October 4th, 2013.
Okay.
And I'm organizing the exhibition with Daniel Baumann, who's a Swiss curator based in Basel, and Tina Kukelski, who's at the museum with me now. So the 3 of us are working on it together as a team. Yeah.
And with this relationship to between the exhibition and the collection, does that change how you think about what to include? And
yeah, I think in some ways this iteration is different in a way because I've been at the museum for 3 years and I will have been there for 4 or 5 before the show opens, and so I have a sort of connection to the collection and the institution. And then, secondly, I think we'll actually be including a sort of specially organized exhibition of works from the collection as part of the International itself, which hasn't really been done before, just to sort of emphasize that connection between the temporary exhibition and then the collection itself, to be a little bit more transparent but also willful in the way that these works kind of live in the institution. And it does mean that the work that's selected for the International, we try to acquire, a quarter to a third of the works in the show or works by artists. So in terms of considering what kind of work will be in the exhibition, it changes the attitude of the show a little bit because we want to include artists who we believe in a way and can, believe in the sense that we want to collect their work, which is not every exhibition that I do needs to be collected, but and there also has to be work that is collectible by an institution. So it's not all objects per se, but there's an awareness that part of the show needs to be recorded within the institution, and so the show itself is from the beginning somewhat based in the idea of a collection and a museum rather than a temporary, biennial space. It's a museum that's embedded in the community and embedded in the history of the place and embedded in a building that's over 100 years old and so has that kind of history as part of it.
Biennials are routinely thought of as being the kind of site for curatorial innovation, at least for the last 20 years. That was really where curators were most experimental in terms of rethinking exhibition formats and agendas. And, there have been all kinds of variations from biennials with 12 artists to biennials whose artists return year after year, or biennials that are entirely made up of programming. What are you thinking about in terms of what obligations do you feel that you have to innovation at this point, or is the International special because of the pressure to acquire some of the work?
I mean, that's a complicated and difficult question, and I think that sense of the responsibility towards innovation can be a sometimes kind of damaging scenario as well when you're just stretching to find a form that's a new form for the sake of a new form. I think that because it's in an institution with a very strong historical memory, we do feel the pressure to do something that distinguishes us from other iterations, but for relevant reasons. And I think the show itself, in terms of the heterogeneity of the artist lists and kind of the kinds of work, will be very different than past internationals, and we're hoping that this international is truly international, because in the past it's been predominantly North American, European, with some Asian, some South American kind of thrown in. And so because there's three of us, our travel schedules are able to be a little bit broader, and we're able to go more places, and we'd like the show to be more representative of that. And we're also including certain projects, like I mentioned, the collection show within the show itself, and there'll be some, like 2 or 3 other sort of specific projects that are not just the exhibition of new international artists, that I think will create a kind of broader context that anchors it within the institution, but without thinking about the institution as an inherently sort of conservative collecting model, but as a site for engagement with audiences and programming that you can't really do in a temporary place, but that's in a place that's sort of cross-disciplinary with a library and a natural history museum, and kind of engages that context and that possibility.
And maybe I'll ask you one more question about, I don't actually know, I mean, I've visited Pittsburgh, but I don't really have a sense of its communities, like, within Pittsburgh, but how well connected is Pittsburgh to other places in the world in terms of populations, and then, does that matter for the institution and also for a biennial or a
what do you
mega
mean
exhibition?
Connected in terms of?
Well, like in terms of immigrant communities, ethnic communities. I mean, I've always felt like certain cities and even the artists that they show, or when they would think about when they would conceive of where the city is.
I mean, Pittsburgh's actually a really interesting scenario in that way, because of course it was founded by immigrants really throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, and immigrant populations from Europe, Eastern Europe, from the sort of classic early 20th century American mix of people who went to go work in the factories. And those immigrant populations are now the sort of bedrock of the city and are no longer really immigrant populations, obviously. But it's not a place where there's been huge fluxes of recent immigration, and partially that's because of there not being job opportunities necessarily, which is the thing that drives, I think, immigration. And so when we're searching for, if you live in LA, it's a little bit more obvious about, like, who are your recent populations and how can you bring those communities into the museum. And that's a question that we ask ourselves often. But I think the way that we answer it is less based on kind of new demographics of people coming in, but more about the way that the museum is very much kind of the people's museum in the city. There's a very strong art classes program where children are coming in and making artwork there, and there's a huge sort of school group program where people are coming in. Like, if you find the image of the museum on Google Maps, it's actually completely obliterated by a line of yellow school buses. You can't see the front of the museum, and so that image is sort of an image that I take with me. And so it's more about, I think, a sort of like repeat visit and building those relationships with people who are there. I mean, that being said, there are new immigrant populations. It's just not on the sort of scale that some other cities are in now.
Well, you're off to China and other parts of the world in the next couple of weeks and months. So good luck with your research, and thanks for coming to talk with me.
Thanks, HG.